The cashier girl was fired for a change mistake, and the millionaire saw a notebook with a drawing on the counter. It was identical to the drawings his daughter used to make before she disappeared 22 years ago. The harsh fluorescent lights of Golden Eagle supermarket buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting everything in that unflattering yellow-green glow that made even the freshest produce look sickly. Valeria Greer wiped the back of her hand across her forehead, pushing away a strand of dark hair that had escaped from her ponytail. 7 hours into her shift, and her feet were already screaming in protest against the worn sneakers she'd been meaning to replace for months. "Next," she called out, her voice carrying that practiced cheerfulness that came from years of customer service training. The smile was automatic now, muscles moving without conscious thought, like a well-rehearsed dance step. Mrs. Patterson shuffled forward with her cart, the wheels squeaking in that familiar rhythm that echoed through the store all day long. "Hello, sweetheart," the elderly woman said, her voice carrying the warmth that made the brutal hours bearable. "How's your grandmother doing?" "She's hanging in there, Mrs. Patterson. Thanks for asking." Valeria's fingers moved efficiently across the scanner, each beep marking another small victory in the endless battle to make ends meet. Bread, milk, cat food, the essentials that made up most people's lives in this neighborhood. When Mrs. Patterson left with her careful, "Take care now," Valeria allowed herself a moment to glance at the small notebook tucked beside her register. Even during the busiest rushes, she found herself stealing moments to add another petal to a sunflower, another delicate wing to a monarch butterfly. The drawings seemed to flow from her pen without conscious thought, as natural as breathing. She'd been drawing these same images since childhood, always sunflowers intertwined with monarch butterflies, always with the same obsessive precision. Margarita, her grandmother, used to find her as a little girl, hunched over paper at the kitchen table, completely absorbed in creating these intricate patterns. When asked why she drew them, Valeria could never explain the compulsion. They just felt right, like something inside her recognized these symbols, even if her mind couldn't place why. "Another one of your flowers." "Huh." Valeria looked up to see Jake Martinez, one of the bag boys, grinning at her during a brief lull between customers. At 19, Jake still had that optimism that hadn't been ground down by years of standing on concrete floors and dealing with difficult customers. "Yeah, can't seem to help myself," she said, closing the notebook quickly. Most people thought her drawings were just a hobby, a way to pass time during slow periods. They didn't understand the almost desperate need she felt to capture these images, as if something vital depended on getting every detail exactly right. The afternoon crowd began to thin out, leaving that strange quiet that settled over the store between the lunch rush and evening shoppers. Valeria used the break to stretch her back and check her phone. A text from Margarita reminded her to pick up the prescription on her way home, the cancer medication that cost more than Valyria made in a week. Even with the insurance they could barely afford. Valeria! The sharp voice cut through her thoughts like a knife. Alonzo Parker, the store manager, strode toward her register with that particular expression that meant trouble. His thin face was pinched with irritation, his cheap tie slightly askew from what was probably his third coffee break of the day. "Yes, Mr. Parker." She straightened instinctively, the way everyone did when Alonso was in one of his moods. "We need to talk, Mrs. Chen called about her receipt from yesterday, says you shortchanged her $20. Valeria's stomach dropped. "That's impossible. I always count twice. You know that." "Well, apparently not carefully enough." His voice carried that tone of satisfaction that came from having someone to blame for whatever was eating at him. "This isn't the first complaint we've had." "What other complaints?" The words came out sharper than she'd intended, in 5 years at Golden Eagle. She'd never had a single issue with her register. Her drawer always balanced to the penny. "Don't take that tone with me, Greer. You think because you've been here a while that makes you special." His voice was rising now, carrying across the store. Other employees were starting to stare, customers pausing in their shopping to watch the drama unfold. "Mr. Parker, I think there's been a mistake. Let me check yesterday's receipts, maybe..." "No maybe about it, Mrs. Chen is a valued customer, and she says you pocketed her change. That's theft, pure and simple." The accusation hit her like a physical blow. Around them, the store had gone quiet except for the endless loop of elevator music and the hum of the refrigerated cases. Valeria could feel eyes on her, judging, wondering if the girl they'd seen working here for years was really a thief. "I would never steal from a customer. Let me explain. The only explanation I need is why you thought you could get away with it." Alonzo was in full performance mode now, playing to his audience of shocked customers and nervous employees. "Clean out your locker. You're done here." The words echoed in the sudden silence. Valyria felt the blood drain from her face as the reality sank in. Fired. Over $20 she'd never touched. By a man who'd been looking for an excuse to get rid of her since the day he'd been promoted over her 2 years ago. "Mr. Parker, please, my grandmother's medical bills. I need this job. Should have thought about that before you decided to play fast and loose with company money." He crossed his arms, enjoying the power. "Security will escort you out." The walk to the employee break room felt like a death march. Her hands shook as she opened her locker, stuffing her spare shirt and the half-eaten sandwich from lunch into a plastic bag. The notebook with her drawings lay forgotten on the register counter, abandoned in the chaos of her sudden dismissal. 5 years. 5 years of arriving early, staying late, covering for other people's sick days, and it all ended with this public humiliation. The whispers followed her as she walked back through the store. Security guard Tom Rodriguez looking apologetic, but dutiful as he accompanied her to the door. "I'm sorry, Val," Tom murmured as they reached the exit. "This is bullshit, and everyone knows it." Outside, the Chicago summer heat hit her like a wall. The contrast between the air-conditioned store and the sweltering street made her head spin. Or maybe that was just the shock finally setting in. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching through the glass as life in Golden Eagle continued without her, as if she'd never existed at all. The bus ride home passed in a blur. Pilsen's familiar streets rolled by outside the window, the murals telling stories of struggle and hope, the corner stores with their hand-painted signs, the kids playing in fire hydrant spray while their mothers watched from lawn chairs. This neighborhood had been her whole world for as long as she could remember, and now even that felt uncertain. Margarita was waiting in her usual spot when Valeria climbed the steps to their small adobe house. Her grandmother's once sturdy frame had withered over the past months, but her eyes were still sharp, still full of the love that had sustained them both through every hardship. "Mija, you're home early." Margarita's voice carried a note of concern. At 73, she could read Valeria's moods like a favorite book, worn soft from years of handling. "I got fired." The words came out flat. Emotionless, she couldn't bring herself to look at her grandmother's face, couldn't bear to see the worry that would replace the brief moment of hope. Silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. The medical bills, the rent, the dozen small expenses that made up their careful budget, all of it suddenly uncertain. "What happened, sweetheart?" Valeria finally met her grandmother's eyes and saw not judgment or panic, but the steady strength that had carried them through every crisis. She sank into the chair beside Margarita's wheelchair and told her everything. The false accusation, the public humiliation, the security escort out of the only job she'd known as an adult. When she finished, Margarita reached over and took her hand. The older woman's fingers were thin now, marked by age spots and the faint scars from decades of hard work, but they were warm and sure. 30 years I spent cleaning offices downtown," Margarita said softly. "You know what I learned. Sometimes losing one door just means finding a better one. You're strong, Mija, stronger than you know." As evening settled over Pilsen, Valeria sat in the small garden behind their house, watching monarch butterflies dance among the sunflowers Margarita had planted years ago. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here were the same images she compulsively drew, living and breathing in her own backyard. She didn't know it yet, but 20 blocks away, a man with graying hair and green eyes was sitting in his study, staring at a small notebook filled with drawings that would change both their lives forever. Eduardo Henderson had never stepped foot inside a Golden Eagle supermarket before that suffocating Tuesday afternoon in July. Hell, he couldn't remember the last time he'd done his own grocery shopping at all. That was what assistants were for, what delivery services existed to handle. But Dr. Marta Morris had been insistent during their session the week before. "You're disconnected, Eduardo," she'd said in that gentle but firm way that made him pay attention after months of going through the motions in therapy. "When's the last time you did something ordinary people do, stood in line at a store, made small talk with a cashier, existed in the world instead of floating above it?" So here he was, pushing a cart through aisles of cereal and canned goods, feeling like an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and everything smelled faintly of floor cleaner and something he couldn't quite identify. Other shoppers moved around him with practiced efficiency, their carts loaded with the mundane necessities of life that his household staff had always handled. Eduardo had built Santa Maria Holdings into a billion-dollar empire by understanding patterns, by seeing connections that others missed. But walking through Golden Eagle, he felt completely out of his element. The prices seemed reasonable, though he had no real reference point. The produce looked fresh enough. People went about their business with the quiet determination of those who knew exactly what they were doing. He was reaching for a carton of milk, something he hadn't personally bought in probably 20 years, when the raised voices caught his attention. Near the front of the store, a thin man in a cheap tie was berating a young woman at one of the checkout lanes, even from a distance. Eduardo could hear the accusations. The public humiliation being played out for everyone to see. That's theft, pure and simple. The words cut through the ambient noise of the store like a blade. Eduardo found himself moving closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. The girl, she couldn't be more than 25, stood frozen as the manager continued his verbal assault. Her face had gone pale, but she held herself with a dignity that spoke of inner strength. "I would never steal from a customer," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious distress. "Let me explain. The only explanation I need is why you thought you could get away with it." Eduardo had seen enough boardroom theatrics to recognize a power play when he saw one. This wasn't about $20 or customer service. This was about a petty tyrant exercising the only authority he had, grinding someone down because he could. The injustice of it stirred something in Eduardo that had been dormant for years, a sense of righteous anger that reminded him why he'd gotten into business in the first place. Before grief had hollowed him out, he watched as the young woman was escorted out, her shoulders straight. Despite the whispers following her, she moved with grace under pressure, and something about her bearing reminded him of... But no, he'd learned years ago not to chase shadows, not to see Clara in every young woman with dark hair and determined eyes. It was only after she'd disappeared through the automatic doors that Eduardo noticed the small notebook lying forgotten on the checkout counter. The manager had already moved on to other business, leaving the abandoned item sitting there like an afterthought. Eduardo approached the register, ostensibly to pay for his milk, but his attention was entirely focused on that notebook. "Excuse me," he said to the teenage boy who'd taken over the register. "This belongs to the young woman who just left." "Oh yeah, that's Valeria's. She's always drawing in that thing." The kid, Jake, according to his name tag, shook his head sadly. "Man, that was so messed up what just happened. Val's the most honest person I know." Eduardo's hand trembled slightly as he picked up the notebook. "Mind if I'd like to return it to her." Jake looked uncertain. "I probably shouldn't give out personal information, but..." He glanced around to make sure the manager wasn't watching. "She lives over in Pilsen. If you really want to get it back to her, I could maybe..." But Eduardo wasn't listening anymore. He'd opened the notebook, and the world had stopped spinning. The drawing on the first page was a sunflower, its petals rendered in exquisite detail, intertwined with monarch butterflies that seemed to dance across the paper. But it wasn't just any sunflower, any butterfly. It was exact, down to the last curve of each petal, the precise pattern of spots on delicate wings. It was identical, impossibly, heartbreakingly identical, to the drawings that filled dozens of sketchbooks in his study at home. Clara's drawings. His hands shook as he turned the pages, each one revealing more of the same obsessive precision, the same inexplicable symbols that his 5-year-old daughter had drawn constantly in the months before she disappeared. Sunflowers and monarchs, over and over, as if she were trying to tell him something he couldn't understand. The notebook slipped from his nerveless fingers, hitting the floor with a soft thud that somehow echoed like thunder in his ears. 22 years. 22 years of searching, of hoping, of following every lead until they all turned cold. 22 years of birthday cakes for a child who never came home. Of Christmas presents wrapped for hands that never opened them. "Sir, are you okay?" Jake's voice seemed to come from very far away. Eduardo bent to retrieve the notebook, his vision blurring. When he straightened, the teenager was looking at him with concern, and Eduardo realized he was crying, in the middle of a supermarket. Surrounded by strangers buying their weekly groceries, the shell he'd built around his heart for over 2 decades was finally cracking. "The girl who drew these," he managed to say, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Valeria? What's her last name?" "Greer," Jake said immediately. "Valeria Greer. She's worked here forever, takes care of her grandmother. Really sweet lady, you know. This whole thing is just..." He trailed off, obviously uncomfortable with Eduardo's reaction. Greer. Eduardo committed the name to memory, though he knew he'd never forget it. Clara Henderson had become Valeria Greer somewhere in the maze of 22 lost years. But she was alive. She was real. She was making drawings that proved some part of her remembered, even if she didn't understand what those memories meant. Eduardo paid for his milk with hands that shook so badly he could barely sign the receipt. He clutched the notebook like a lifeline as he walked to his car, his legs unsteady beneath him. The Tesla felt like a spaceship compared to the humble reality of Golden Eagle, but he barely noticed the contrast. His mind was already racing ahead, planning, calculating, desperate to believe, but terrified of another crushing disappointment. The drive back to his estate passed in a blur of Chicago traffic and half-formed prayers. He'd stopped believing in God the night Clara disappeared, but found himself bargaining with whatever forces might be listening. Let it be her. Let it really be her this time. His study looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The same mahogany desk, the same leather chairs, the same wall of windows overlooking the garden where Clara used to play. But everything felt different now, charged with possibility and terror in equal measure. Eduardo went straight to the cabinet where he kept Clara's things, the artifacts of a childhood cut short. The sketchbooks were right where they'd always been, wrapped in tissue paper like sacred relics. He'd looked through them 1,000 times over the years, memorizing every line, every smudge, every evidence of his daughter's beautiful, mysterious mind. With trembling fingers, he opened the first one and placed it side by side with Valeria's notebook. The drawings were identical, not similar, not reminiscent, identical, as if the same hand had drawn them 22 years apart. The same obsessive attention to detail, the same inexplicable combination of symbols, the same style that was uniquely, unmistakably Clara's. Eduardo reached for his phone with shaking hands. Armando Holt answered on the second ring, his gravelly voice carrying the weariness of a man who'd spent decades dealing with other people's tragedies. "Eddie, it's been a while. What's going on?" "I need you to find someone," Eduardo said without preamble. "Tonight her name is Valeria Greer, lives in Pilsen, worked, at Golden Eagle Supermarket on Ashland." "Okay, slow down. What's this about?" Eduardo looked down at the notebook spread across his desk, at the evidence that seemed impossible but was right there in front of him. "I think I found her, Armando. I think I found Clara." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. Armando had been through this before with Eduardo. The false hopes, the leads that went nowhere, the crushing disappointments that followed every moment of possibility. "Eddie, you know I'll do whatever you need, but..." "No buts." Eduardo's voice carried a certainty he hadn't felt in decades. "Come over tonight. Look at what I found. You'll understand." After he hung up, Eduardo sat alone in his study as the sun set over Chicago. The notebooks lay open before him, pages of hope and heartbreak illuminated by the soft glow of his desk lamp. Somewhere across the city, a young woman named Valeria Greer was probably wondering how she was going to pay her grandmother's medical bills without her job at Golden Eagle. She had no idea that her world was about to change forever. Eduardo picked up one of Clara's old drawings, a sunflower with a monarch butterfly perched on its petals, and held it up to the window. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the paper, making the delicate lines glow like stained glass. "I'm coming for you, baby girl," he whispered to the empty room. "Daddy's finally coming to bring you home." Armando Holt had seen Eduardo Henderson at his lowest points. The sleepless nights after Clara's disappearance, the desperate calls at 3 a.m, the false leads that shattered hope like glass against concrete. But the man sitting across from him in the study that night was different. There was something electric in Eduardo's eyes, a certainty that Armando hadn't seen in over 2 decades. "Look at them," Eduardo said, pushing the notebooks across the mahogany desk. "Really look." Armando had been a detective for 35 years before going private, He'd worked missing persons cases that would haunt most people's dreams, but he'd never seen anything like what lay before him. The drawings were identical in every way that mattered. The same obsessive precision, the same impossible combination of sunflowers and monarch butterflies, the same distinctive style that was like a fingerprint of the soul. Jesus Christ. Eddie, Armando's weathered hands traced the edges of the pages. Where did you get this? Eduardo told him about Golden Eagle, about the girl who'd been fired over $20, about the notebook left behind like a message in a bottle. As he spoke, Armando could see the years of grief lifting from his friend's shoulders, replaced by something more dangerous, hope. I need everything you can find on Valeria Greer, Eduardo continued. Background, family history, where she came from, how she ended up in Chicago, and I need it fast. Armando nodded, already making mental notes. I'll start tonight, pull property records, employment history, school records if I can find them. But Eddie, he paused, choosing his words carefully. You know we've been here before. Similar drawings, coincidences that seemed impossible until they weren't. This is different. That's what you said about the girl in Portland and the one in Denver. Eduardo's jaw tightened. Those girls didn't draw exactly what Clara drew. This isn't similar, Armando. It's identical, down to the last detail. While the two men planned their investigation across town, Camila Henderson stood at her bedroom window, watching the lights in her husband's study burn well past midnight for 20 years. She'd perfected the art of reading Eduardo's moods, of anticipating his needs and desires. It was a survival skill she'd developed during their courtship, refined during their marriage, and now wielded like a weapon when necessary. Something had changed today. She could see it in the set of his shoulders when he'd returned from his strange shopping expedition, could hear it in the urgent tone of his phone call to that detective. Camila had excellent hearing, a gift that had served her well during her nursing career and served her even better as Eduardo's wife. She'd heard him say a name, Valeria Greer. Camila's reflection stared back at her from the dark window. 48 years old, still beautiful in that cold, calculated way that had first attracted Eduardo when he was vulnerable and broken. She'd been careful to maintain her appearance over the years, understanding that her position depended on more than just being Mrs. Henderson. It depended on being irreplaceable, but she'd never truly been irreplaceable. Had she? Clara had always been there between them, a ghost that haunted their marriage bed, a memory that kept Eduardo's heart locked away where Camila could never fully reach it. Even after 20 years, even after all her careful work to build their life together, Clara remained Eduardo's first love. His greatest loss, his deepest wound, the thought of that wound healing, of Eduardo finding peace outside of their marriage, sent ice through Camila's veins. 23 years ago, Camila Rodriguez had been a different person, fresh out of nursing school, idealistic enough to believe in love and naive enough to think it conquered all. She'd been assigned to the maternity ward at Chicago General when Anna Henderson arrived in labor. Complications already evident from the moment she walked through the doors. Anna had been everything Camila wasn't. Warm where Camila was cold, generous where Camila was calculating, effortlessly beautiful where Camila had to work for every compliment. And she'd been married to Eduardo Henderson, the grieving widower whose tragedy was already legend in Chicago's social circles. Camila had watched Anna die despite every effort to save her, had seen Eduardo's world collapse as he held his newborn daughter while mourning his dead wife. She'd been there for the sleepless nights that followed, the moments when Eduardo needed someone, anyone, to help him figure out how to be a single father to a baby who looked exactly like the woman he'd lost. It should have been enough, caring for Clara, supporting Eduardo through his grief, slowly becoming indispensable to their small family for 2 years. Camila had been content with the role of trusted friend, confidant, the woman Eduardo called when he needed advice about teething or sleep schedules, or the 1,000 tiny crises that came with raising a child alone. But contentment had turned to obsession, and obsession had bred desperation. Clara was the center of Eduardo's universe, the reason he got up every morning, the source of every smile that lit up his face. As long as Clara existed, Camila would always be secondary, always competing with a 5-year-old for the attention of the man she'd convinced herself she couldn't live without. The plan had taken months to develop. Camila's nursing training had given her access to medications, knowledge of how the human body responded to various chemical combinations. Her work at the hospital had introduced her to families in crisis, people desperate enough to consider options they'd never imagine under normal circumstances. Valeria Greer had been perfect. A young mother destroyed by the loss of her own 5-year-old daughter in a traffic accident, drowning in medical bills and consumed by grief that made her vulnerable to suggestion, Camila had approached her carefully, presenting the idea as a chance for healing, for both Maria and for a little girl who needed a mother's love. "Think of it as God giving you both a second chance," Camila had whispered during one of their secret meetings in the hospital parking garage. "She needs you, and you need her. You can save each other." The money had helped, of course, enough to cover Maria's debts and start fresh somewhere far from Chicago, away from the memories that haunted every corner of her old life. But Camila had been careful to present it as secondary to the emotional appeal, understanding that Maria needed to believe she was doing something noble, not just criminal. Ramon Greer, Maria's truck driver brother, had been easier to convince. He'd seen his sister's breakdown, understood that she was drowning in grief and guilt. When Camila presented him with a solution that would give Maria purpose again, while solving his own financial problems, he'd agreed without asking too many questions. The kidnapping itself had been almost anticlimactic. During a birthday party at the Henderson estate, Camila had slipped a mild sedative into Clara's juice. Nothing dangerous, just enough to make her sleepy and compliant. When the child nodded off in her bedroom during the chaos of the party, it had been easy enough to pass her through a window to Ramon, who'd been waiting in the service alley behind the house. The search that followed had been thorough but misdirected. Eduardo had assumed Clara had wandered off or been taken by a stranger. He'd never suspected the woman who'd been helping care for his daughter, who'd been present for every police interview, who'd held him while he cried and sworn to do everything possible to bring Clara home. The memory drugs had been the cruelest part, but Camila had convinced herself they were necessary. Clara had been old enough to remember her father, her real name, her life before the kidnapping. The mild amnesiacs Camila provided Maria had worked slowly, erasing memories like a gentle tide washing away sandcastles. Within months, Clara had accepted her new identity as Valyria, had bonded with Maria as her grandmother, had started drawing the same obsessive pictures but without understanding why. Watching Eduardo's breakdown had been both satisfying and terrifying. Satisfying because it proved how much he'd needed her, how lost he was without her guidance and support. Terrifying because she'd realized how completely she'd destroyed the man she claimed to love, how thoroughly she'd broken the very thing she'd wanted to possess. But she'd had 20 years to build their life together. 20 years to become Mrs. Eduardo Henderson, to establish herself as his partner in business and society. She'd given him stability, companionship, a reason to keep functioning even if she'd never been able to give him love. It had been enough, or at least she'd convinced herself it was. Now, watching the lights burn in his study, Camila realized her carefully constructed world was under threat. Eduardo had found something, or someone, that had rekindled the dangerous flame of hope she'd thought was permanently extinguished. The name Valeria Greer hung in the air like a sword over everything she'd built. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she needed. Carlos Gibson answered on the third ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Camila, it's after midnight. What's wrong? I need you to do something for me," she said without preamble. Quietly, a background check on someone named Valeria Greer. Lives in Pilsen, works at Golden Eagle Supermarket. Carlos had been her accountant for years, managing the discreet finances that Eduardo never asked about. He knew how to find information without leaving traces, how to handle sensitive matters with the kind of discretion that came with a generous retainer. "How deep do you want me to go?" Camila stared out at the darkness beyond her window, at the perfectly manicured grounds that represented everything she'd worked to achieve. "All the way. I want to know everything about her, her family, where she came from, and Carlos." She paused, making sure he understood the gravity of her request. "I need this by tomorrow." After she hung up, Camila stood alone in her bedroom, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and respectability that had never quite filled the hollow space in her chest. 23 years ago, she'd made a choice that had seemed like the only option available to a woman desperate for love. Now she was about to discover whether that choice would finally destroy everything she'd fought to build. In her study downstairs, Eduardo was making plans to bring his daughter home. Neither of them knew that their collision course had been set in motion by events neither could control. by secrets that had been buried, but never truly dead. The truth was rising to the surface like a body thrown into deep water, and Camila was running out of time to keep it submerged. The morning sun cast long shadows across Pilsen as Eduardo sat in his Tesla, parked half a block from the small adobe house that Armando had identified as Valeria Greer's address. He'd been there since 6 a.m., watching the quiet neighborhood come to life, children walking to school, adults heading to work, the familiar rhythm of a community that knew itself. Armando had worked through the night, pulling together a picture of Valeria's life that was both mundane and heartbreaking. 27 years old, no record of birth in any Chicago hospital, first appeared in the system when she started kindergarten in Pilsen, living with Maria Greer, who'd legally changed her name to Margarita around the same time. Clean employment record, no criminal history, medical insurance claims for her grandmother's cancer treatment that would bankrupt most families. What was missing was more telling than what was there. No baby pictures, no medical records before age 5, no extended family anywhere in the databases. It was as if Valeria Greer had materialized out of thin air at exactly the age Clara Henderson had disappeared. Eduardo's hands gripped the steering wheel as he watched the front door of the house. Part of him wanted to march up those steps, knock on the door, and demand answers. But Armando had been right about caution. If this really was Clara, if she'd been living here for 22 years believing Margarita was her grandmother, the shock could be devastating. They needed to understand the situation completely before making any moves. At 7:30, the door opened. Eduardo's breath caught as Valeria emerged, helping an elderly woman in a wheelchair navigate the small ramp that had been built over the front steps. Even from a distance, the resemblance was unmistakable. She had Anna's delicate bone structure, Eduardo's green eyes, and that particular way of tilting her head when concentrating, that had been uniquely Clara's. But it was her movements that convinced him completely. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when nervous, the graceful efficiency of her gestures, the protective instinct that had her checking and double-checking the wheelchair's position before stepping away. These weren't learned behaviors. They were encoded in her DNA, part of who she was at the deepest level. Valeria kissed the older woman's forehead and headed down the street on foot, presumably to look for another job. Eduardo waited until she'd turned the corner before getting out of his car and approaching the house. If he was going to understand the full situation, he needed to talk to the woman who'd raised his daughter. Margarita Greer was dozing in her wheelchair in the morning sun when Eduardo knocked on the doorframe. She startled awake, immediately alert. Despite her obvious illness, her eyes, still sharp despite the ravages of cancer, took in his expensive clothes, his carefully groomed appearance, the general air of wealth that surrounded him like an aura. "Can I help you?" Her voice carried the careful politeness of someone who'd learned to be wary of unexpected visitors, especially ones who clearly didn't belong in the neighborhood. "Mrs. Greer, my name is Eduardo Henderson. I was hoping we could talk about Valyria." The change in her expression was immediate and telling. The politeness disappeared, replaced by something that looked like terror. Her hands gripped the arms of her wheelchair so tightly her knuckles went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do." Eduardo kept his voice gentle, non-threatening. "I think you've been waiting for this conversation for a very long time." Margarita stared at him for a long moment, and Eduardo could see decades of guilt and fear warring with relief in her eyes. Finally, she gestured toward the empty chair beside her. 22 years, she whispered. "I wondered when someone would come." Eduardo sat down carefully, close enough to speak quietly, but far enough away not to feel threatening. "Tell me about the night she came to you." Her name was Clara then. Margarita's voice was barely audible. "Such a scared little girl, confused and crying for her papa. The woman who brought her said she was an orphan, that her parents had died and she needed somewhere safe to stay. I'd just lost my Lena, my granddaughter, and I." She broke off, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "You were grieving. Someone took advantage of that grief. I wanted to believe it was God's plan. You understand? That he was giving me another chance to be a grandmother, giving that little girl a chance to be loved. But deep down, I always knew something wasn't right. The way she flinched when people raised their voices, the nightmares, the way she'd draw those same pictures over and over like she was trying to remember something." Eduardo's heart clenched. What happened to the woman who brought her? She came back every few months for the first year, brought medicine for Clara, Said it was vitamins to help her adjust to the trauma of losing her parents. I thought I was helping her heal. Margarita's voice broke completely. I was poisoning her memories. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Someone had orchestrated Clara's disappearance with surgical precision, using Margarita's grief as a weapon, and slowly erasing his daughter's memories with drugs. The question was, who had the access, the knowledge, and the motivation to plan something so elaborate? Mrs. Greer, I need you to think carefully. This woman who brought Clara to you, can you describe her? Margarita closed her eyes, summoning memories she'd probably tried to bury for decades. Pretty, but cold, like ice that looked like water. She spoke Spanish, but not like us, like someone who'd learned it in school, not at home. She was a nurse. I think, always knew about medicines, about how much to give Clara. Eduardo's blood ran cold. A nurse with access to medications, someone who could blend in at a hospital, someone educated enough to plan this kind of operation. The description was vague, but something about it nagged at him. Did she ever mention her name? Called herself Carmen, but I don't think that was real. She paid in cash, always, and she knew things about Clara that seemed impossible if she was really an orphan. Little things, that she was left-handed, that she was afraid of thunderstorms, that she loved strawberry ice cream. Eduardo's hands were shaking now. Those details weren't in any public record. They were intimate knowledge, the kind of information only someone close to Clara would have known, someone who'd spent time with her, watched her, learned her habits and preferences, someone inside their circle, across town. Valyria was discovering that finding a new job in Pilsen wasn't as simple as walking into stores and asking. The morning had been a series of polite rejections, apologetic managers explaining that they weren't hiring, sympathetic but unhelpful suggestions to try again next month. She found herself in Dvorak Park, sitting on a bench and trying not to think about the bills piling up at home, the prescription that needed to be filled, the rent that was due next week. The notebook Eduardo had found lay open in her lap, and she was adding details to a sunflower when a shadow fell across the page. Those are beautiful. Valyria looked up to see a well-dressed woman in her 40s, perfectly put together in that way that spoke of money and careful attention to appearance. Something about her made Valyria instinctively wary. Thank you. She started to close the notebook, but the woman sat down beside her before she could. I'm Camila Henderson. I couldn't help but notice your drawings. They're quite distinctive. The name meant nothing to Valyria, but there was something in the woman's tone that set off alarm bells. The way she was looking at the notebook, at Valyria herself, felt predatory. I should get going, Valyria said, standing and clutching the notebook to her chest. Of course, but if you're looking for work, I might know of some opportunities. I'm involved with several charities in the area. We're always looking for reliable people. Camila pressed a business card into Valeria's hand before walking away, leaving behind only the faint scent of expensive perfume and an inexplicable feeling of dread. Back at the adobe house, Eduardo was helping Margarita into her wheelchair when his phone rang. Armando's voice was tight with excitement. Eddie, you need to hear this. I've been digging into the hospital records from when Anna died. Guess who was working the maternity ward that night? Eduardo's heart stopped. Tell me. Camila Rodriguez, your wife, Eddie. She was there when Anna died, when Clara was born. She had access to everything. Medical records, personal information, the whole family situation. The phone slipped from Eduardo's nerveless fingers, clattering onto the concrete. 20 years of marriage, 20 years of comfort and companionship, 20 years of believing he'd found someone who understood his loss, 20 years of living with the woman who'd orchestrated it. Margarita was watching him with knowing eyes. You figured it out, didn't you? Who took your little girl? Eduardo nodded, unable to speak. The betrayal cut deeper than Clara's disappearance, deeper than 22 years of grief. Camila hadn't just stolen his daughter. She'd stolen his ability to trust, to love, to believe in the goodness of other people. What are you going to do? Margarita asked. Eduardo picked up his phone with hands that shook with rage and determination. I'm going to bring my daughter home, and then I'm going to make sure the woman who destroyed our family pays for what she's done. The war was coming, and Eduardo finally knew who his enemy was. The private terminal at O'Hare was bustling with the quiet efficiency that money could buy when Sebastian Gibson stepped off the plane from Zurich. At 19, he carried himself with the confident posture of someone who'd been educated in Switzerland's finest institutions, but his eyes held an uncertainty that came from being summoned home without explanation. He'd received the call from his mother 3 days ago. Urgent, cryptic, demanding his immediate return to Chicago. Camila had been vague about the reasons, mentioning only that there were family matters that required his attention. For a woman who'd always been precise in her communications, the evasiveness had been unsettling. The car waiting for him was a sleek BMW, driven by a man he didn't recognize as they pulled away from the airport. Sebastian stared out at the Chicago skyline, trying to reconcile his memories of brief childhood visits with the reality of a city that had never quite felt like home. Switzerland had been his world for the past 15 years. Clean, ordered, predictable. Chicago seemed chaotic by comparison, full of noise and energy that made him feel like a tourist in his own country. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Welcome home, mijo. We have much to discuss. I'll meet you at the Fairmont, room 2847. The Fairmont was classic Camila. Expensive, discreet, and designed to impress. Sebastian had learned years ago that his mother conducted her most important business in hotel rooms and private clubs. Away from the prying eyes of household staff and security cameras, it was a habit that had always puzzled him, but he'd never questioned it directly. Meanwhile, Carlos Gibson sat in his cramped office above a tax preparation service in Humboldt Park, staring at the background report that had taken him 18 hours to compile. What he'd found about Valeria Greer defied explanation, and every instinct he'd developed during 20 years as an accountant was screaming warnings. The gaps in her history were surgical, too precise to be accidental. No birth certificate in Illinois, no early medical records, no documentation of any kind before age 5. It was as if someone had carefully erased the first 5 years of her life with the kind of thoroughness that required either government resources or serious money. But it was the financial trail that truly disturbed him. Over the years, Camila had made dozens of cash withdrawals from various accounts, always in amounts just below the federal reporting requirements. The pattern had started 23 years ago and continued for several years before tapering off. The timing was suspicious, but without more context, Carlos couldn't piece together what it all meant. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone to call Camila. Carlos had always suspected that his employer's wife had secrets. Wealthy people always did, but this felt different. This felt dangerous. At the Henderson estate, Eduardo sat in his study surrounded by 2 decades of investigation files, police reports, and private detective summaries. Armando had brought additional materials: surveillance footage from the supermarket, credit card records, phone logs that painted a picture of Camila's activities over the past week. The woman Eduardo had shared his bed with for 20 years had been busy. Phone calls to Carlos Gibson, meetings at locations she'd never mentioned, credit card charges at stores in neighborhoods she'd never expressed interest in visiting. The pattern suggested someone preparing for either a long trip or a permanent disappearance. "She knows we're getting close," Armando said, pointing to a photograph of Camila leaving a Bank of America branch in Lincoln Park. "This was yesterday morning. She withdrew $15,000 in cash." Eduardo studied his wife's face in the photograph. Even grainy security footage couldn't disguise the tension in her shoulders, the way she moved with quick, nervous energy that was completely unlike her usual composed demeanor. This was a woman under pressure, someone whose carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. "Have you found any connection between her and the Greer family?" Armando shook his head. "Nothing direct, but I did find something interesting." He pulled out another file. 23 years ago, around the time Clara disappeared, there were several cash payments made to a trucking company in Indiana. The owner was Ramon Greer, Margarita's brother. The pieces were falling into place with nauseating clarity. Ramon Greer had been the transportation, moving Clara from Chicago to wherever Camila had arranged for her to disappear. The brother had been the weak link in the chain, someone who could be bought, and who had family connections that made him perfect for the job. Where's Ramon now? Dead, truck accident in 2018. But before he died, he made some interesting calls. Guess who he tried to contact multiple times in the weeks before his death? Eduardo didn't need to guess. The pattern was becoming clear. Ramon had probably been having second thoughts, maybe threatening to expose the truth. Camila would have seen him as a liability that needed to be managed. "We need to move fast," Eduardo said. "If she's withdrawing cash and making preparations, She might be planning to run. At the Fairmont Hotel, Sebastian knocked on the door of room 2847, wondering why his mother had chosen to meet him here instead of at their house in Winnetka. The woman who opened the door looked like Camila but felt like a stranger. There was something wild in her eyes, a desperation that transformed her familiar features into something almost frightening. "Sebastian, mi amor." She pulled him into a hug that lasted too long, holding him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "I've missed you so much." The hotel room was elegant but impersonal, and Sebastian noticed immediately that his mother had been drinking. There was a half-empty bottle of wine on the table, and her speech had the careful precision of someone trying to hide their intoxication. "Mom, what's going on? Why did you need me to come back so urgently?" Camila moved to the window, staring out at the Chicago skyline with an expression that Sebastian couldn't read. When she spoke, her voice was distant, as if she were talking to herself rather than to him. "I want to tell you about your father." Sebastian's blood went cold. In 19 years, his mother had never discussed his parentage beyond vague references to a relationship that hadn't worked out. He'd always assumed it was a painful subject, perhaps involving a man who'd abandoned them when she became pregnant. "Carlos Gibson isn't just our accountant, is he?" Camila turned back to face him, and Sebastian saw tears streaming down her cheeks. "He's your biological father. We had an affair when I was working at the hospital, when I was young and stupid and thought I could have everything I wanted." The confession hit him like a physical blow. 19 years of believing he was the product of some anonymous relationship, of wondering about his heritage and genetic history, and it had all been a lie. Worse, it meant his mother had been having an affair with a married man, that Sebastian's entire existence was built on betrayal. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because everything is falling apart, and I need you to understand why I did what I did." Camila sat down heavily on the bed, looking older than her 48 years. "I need you to know that every choice I made was because I loved you, because I wanted to give you the best life possible." Sebastian felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in his mother's tone that suggested this conversation was going to get much worse. "What choices, Mom? What are you talking about?" For a moment, Camila seemed to struggle with herself, as if part of her wanted to maintain the lies that had sustained them for so long. But the wine and the pressure and the weight of decades of secrets finally broke through her defenses. "Eduardo Henderson isn't your stepfather, mi amor. He's the man whose life I destroyed to build ours." The story came out in pieces, fragments of confession mixed with justification and self-pity. Sebastian listened in growing horror as his mother described the night she'd taken Clara Henderson, the elaborate plan to erase the child's memories. The years of manipulation that had followed, with each revelation, his understanding of his mother, his family, and himself crumbled. "You kidnapped a 5-year-old girl," he whispered, the words feeling surreal in his mouth. "I saved her." Camila's voice was fierce, desperate. Anna was dead. Eduardo was falling apart. That little girl needed stability. I gave her a loving home with Margarita. I made sure she was cared for. You erased her identity. You drugged a child to make her forget her own father. I did what I had to do to survive, to give us a chance at happiness. You don't understand what it was like, watching Eduardo pine for a dead woman, knowing that as long as Clara existed, I would never be enough. Sebastian stood up abruptly, pacing to the window to put distance between himself and the woman who was revealing herself to be a stranger. The Chicago skyline stretched out before him, millions of people living their lives. And somewhere among them was a woman named Valyria, who had no idea that her entire existence was built on his mother's crimes. Where is she now, Clara? Her name is Valeria Greer. She lives in Pilsen with the woman who raised her. Camila's voice had gone flat, emotionless. Eduardo found her notebook, recognized the drawings. He knows everything. The implications hit Sebastian like a sledgehammer. His comfortable life in Switzerland, his education, his future. All of it had been paid for with blood money, funded by the destruction of another family. Every advantage he'd been given had come at the cost of a father's grief and a daughter's stolen childhood. What happens now? Camila finished her wine and stared at the empty glass as if it held answers. Now we run, or we fight. I haven't decided yet. But looking at his mother, really looking at her for the first time in his life, Sebastian realized he'd already made his choice. The woman sitting before him wasn't the person who'd raised him. who'd taught him about right and wrong, who'd instilled in him the values that now made her actions seem monstrous. She was a stranger wearing his mother's face, and he couldn't be part of whatever came next. "I need some air," he said, moving toward the door. "Sebastian, please. You're all I have left." He paused with his hand on the doorknob, looking back at the woman who'd given him life and now revealed herself to be capable of destroying others. "No, Mom. I think you lost me a long time ago. I just didn't know it yet." The hospice nurse had left an hour ago, adjusting Margarita's morphine drip and speaking in the gentle, practiced tones that meant the end was approaching faster than anyone was ready to accept. Valyria sat beside the hospital bed they'd set up in the living room, holding her grandmother's hand and trying not to think about the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen table or the job interviews that had led nowhere. "Mija." Margarita's voice was barely a whisper, each word an effort that seemed to cost her more than she could afford. "Come closer. There's something I need to tell you." Valyria leaned forward, close enough to smell the antiseptic scent of the medical equipment mixed with the lavender lotion she'd been rubbing on Margarita's hands. Her grandmother's eyes, once so sharp and knowing, were clouded with pain medication. But there was an urgency in them that cut through the drug-induced haze. "You should rest, Abuela. Save your strength." "No." The word came out stronger than anything Margarita had said in days. "I've saved my strength for this moment for 22 years. I won't die with this secret." Something cold settled in Valeria's stomach. In all her years caring for Margarita, through all the late-night conversations and shared memories, she'd never heard this tone in her grandmother's voice. This wasn't the gentle woman who'd raised her speaking. This was someone carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear. What secret? "Abuela." Margarita's grip on her hand tightened with surprising strength. "Go to my bedroom, under the loose floorboard beneath my dresser. There's a box. Bring it here." Valyria hesitated, afraid of what she might find, but unable to refuse what might be her grandmother's final request. The bedroom felt different somehow, charged with the weight of revealed secrets. The floorboard came up easily, as if it had been accessed recently, revealing a metal lockbox that looked like it had been hidden for decades. When she returned to the living room, Margarita was struggling to sit up despite the pain it obviously caused her. "Open it," she whispered. "It's time you knew who you really are." The box contained photographs, dozens of them, showing a little girl who looked exactly like Valyria had at the same age. But these weren't the informal snapshots of a working-class family. These were professional portraits, birthday parties in elaborate settings, Christmas mornings with presents that cost more than Valyria made in a month. And in every picture, the little girl was with a man who looked hauntingly familiar. "I don't understand," Valyria said, though part of her was beginning to. "Your name isn't Valeria Greer." "Mija? It's Clara Henderson." Margarita's words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would change everything. "And that man in the pictures is your real father." Valeria's hands shook as she lifted a birth certificate from the box. Clara Elena Henderson, born March 15, 2003. To Eduardo Henderson and Anna Henderson. Parents' address, 1247 Lakeview Drive, Chicago, Illinois. Father's occupation, CEO, Santa Maria Holdings. "This isn't possible." The words came out as barely a breath. "You're my grandmother. You raised me, these pictures. They're not me. Look at the back of that one." Margarita pointed to a professional portrait with a trembling finger. Valyria turned the photograph over, in careful handwriting. Clara's 4th birthday, March 2007. She insisted on drawing pictures for everyone instead of playing games. The handwriting was familiar. She'd seen it on dozens of old birthday cards and Christmas gifts throughout her childhood. Gifts that Margarita had claimed came from distant relatives who cared about them but lived too far away to visit. "You've been lying to me my entire life." The accusation came out hollow. Without the anger it should have carried, Valyria felt disconnected from her own voice, as if she were watching this conversation happen to someone else. "I've been protecting you. Both of us." Tears were streaming down Margarita's weathered cheeks. "Mija, you have to understand. When you came to me, you were so broken, so scared, you cried for your papa every night for months. The woman who brought you said your parents had died, that you needed somewhere safe to heal." "What woman?" Margarita closed her eyes, summoning memories that had obviously haunted her for decades. She said her name was Carmen, but I always knew that wasn't real, beautiful woman. But cold like winter, she was a nurse, knew about medicines and how to help children who'd been traumatized. Valyria pulled out more photographs, including one that made her breath catch. It showed her, Clara, sitting in a garden beside a massive sunflower. A monarch butterfly perched on her outstretched finger. She was laughing in the picture, completely at ease, radiating the kind of joy that Valyria had never quite been able to capture in her own drawings. "The sunflowers and butterflies," she whispered. "That's why I draw them. You were obsessed with them even as a little girl." Carmen said it was trauma, that children sometimes fixated on specific images when they'd been through something terrible. "She gave me medicine to help you forget the painful memories, to help you adjust to your new life. You drugged me. The realization came with a wave of nausea. You erased my memories. I thought I was helping you heal." Margarita's voice broke completely. "You were so sad, so lost. The medicine made you calmer, helped you sleep through the night without nightmares, and gradually you started calling me abuela, started smiling again. I convinced myself I was saving you." Valyria stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out on the small garden where Margarita had planted sunflowers every year since she could remember. Now, she understood why her grandmother had insisted on those particular flowers, why she'd always gotten emotional when Valyria commented on how beautiful they were. "My father," she said, holding up the photograph of the man who'd been in every picture. "He's been looking for me all these years. Hasn't he?" "I don't know. Carmen said your parents were dead, but..." Margarita paused, struggling with a confession that seemed to cost her everything. "There were things that didn't make sense. The clothes you came with were too expensive for an orphan. You knew things. How to use a fork properly. Words that most 5-year-olds don't know. And the way you drew, like you'd been taught by someone who understood art." Valyria pulled out the last item in the box, a small gold ring with the initials CH engraved on the band. It fit perfectly on her ring finger, as if it had been made for her. "This was mine, wasn't it? From before? You were wearing it when Carmen brought you to me. She said it was a family heirloom, that you should keep it even though everything else had to be left behind. I've saved it all these years, waiting for the right time to give it back to you." The weight of 22 years of lies settled on Valyria's shoulders like a physical burden. Every memory she'd cherished, every story Margarita had told her about their family, every moment of their life together had been built on a foundation of deception and stolen identity. But looking at her grandmother, this woman who'd devoted her life to raising her, who'd worked multiple jobs to pay for her education, who'd sacrificed everything to give her a loving home, Valyria couldn't summon the anger she knew she should feel. "Did you love me?" she asked quietly. "Even knowing I wasn't really your granddaughter. Did you love me?" Margarita reached for her hand with what little strength she had left. "Mija, you became my granddaughter the moment you called me abuela. Blood doesn't make family. Love does. You were the greatest gift I ever received, even if I received you in the worst possible way." Valyria knelt beside the bed, taking Margarita's hands in both of hers. "What do I do now? How do I contact him? How do I tell a man I don't remember that I'm the daughter he lost 22 years ago?" "I kept one more thing," Margarita whispered. "In the side pocket of the box, Carmen gave it to me. Said if there were ever any problems, any complications, I should contact that number." Valyria found the piece of paper, yellowed with age but still legible. It was a business card for Henderson Industries, with a phone number written on the back in the same careful handwriting she'd seen on the photographs. "She gave you his number. I think she wanted insurance in case things went wrong, or maybe..." Margarita paused, her breathing becoming more labored. "Maybe part of her always knew this day would come, and she wanted to make sure you could find your way home." As evening settled over Pilsen, Valyria sat beside her dying grandmother, holding the business card that could change everything. Outside, monarch butterflies danced among the sunflowers in the fading light. And for the first time in her life, she understood why those images had always called to her. They weren't just drawings. They were memories, fighting their way to the surface despite years of chemical suppression. They were her soul's way of remembering what her mind had been forced to forget. She was Clara Henderson, daughter of Eduardo Henderson, and somewhere across the city, a father she didn't remember was searching for the little girl he'd never stopped loving. The question now was whether she had the courage to call him. Valeria stared at the business card for 3 hours before she found the courage to dial the number. Her hands shook as she pressed each digit, and she hung up twice before finally letting it ring. When a deep, familiar voice answered on the second ring, her breath caught in her throat. Eduardo Henderson. Mr. Henderson. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. My name is Valeria Greer, but I think my real name might be Clara." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Valeria wondered if the call had been dropped. When Eduardo finally spoke, his voice was thick with tears. "Clara, my God, is it really you?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't remember you, but I have photographs and a birth certificate," and she touched the ring on her finger. "And this ring with the initials C.H. Where are you? Can we meet? I can come to you, or there's a park near my house, Dvorak Park on Cullerton. Could you meet me there tomorrow afternoon?" Eduardo's voice was steady, despite the emotion she could hear beneath the words. "I'll be there, Clara. I've been looking for you for 22 years. Whatever happened, wherever you've been, we're going to figure this out together." After she hung up, Valeria sat in the darkness of her living room, listening to Margarita's labored breathing from the hospital bed. Tomorrow, she would meet the man who claimed to be her father, and everything about her life would change forever. But tonight, she was still Valeria Greer, granddaughter of a dying woman who'd loved her despite the circumstances that had brought them together. "I called him," she whispered to Margarita, not sure if her grandmother was awake. "Good, Misha. It's time." Margarita's voice was so weak that Valeria had to lean close to hear her. "Whatever happens tomorrow, remember that you were loved. Both versions of you were loved." Eduardo didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study, surrounded by 2 decades of Clara's belongings, trying to prepare himself for a reunion he'd dreamed about, but never quite believed would happen. The child he'd lost had been 5 years old, full of laughter and endless questions. The woman he was going to meet tomorrow was 27, shaped by experiences he knew nothing about, raised by people he'd never met. What if she didn't want to be Clara Henderson? What if the life she'd built as Valeria Greer was more real to her than the childhood she couldn't remember? What if he was nothing more than a stranger to her, connected only by DNA and faded photographs? Armando arrived at dawn with coffee and the kind of quiet support that came from decades of friendship. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. This was either the end of Eduardo's longest nightmare or the beginning of an even more complicated reality. At noon, Eduardo and Armando drove to Pilsen in Eduardo's Tesla, the expensive car looking absurdly out of place in the working-class neighborhood. Dvorak Park was small and unpretentious, with playground equipment that had seen better days and a few benches scattered around a modest green space. Eduardo chose a bench near the sunflower garden and tried to calm his racing heart. She appeared at exactly 2 o'clock, walking toward him with careful, measured steps that reminded him immediately of Anna. She was beautiful in a way that took his breath away. Anna's delicate features combined with his own green eyes. But there was a strength in her bearing that spoke of years of hard work and responsibility. When she was close enough to speak, she stopped and studied his face with an intensity that was purely Clara. Even as a child, she'd had that way of looking at people as if she could see straight through to their souls. "You look like the man in the photographs," she said simply. Eduardo stood up slowly, afraid that any sudden movement might break the spell. "You look like your mother, but you have my eyes." They stared at each other for a long moment, 2 strangers connected by bonds they could feel but couldn't quite understand. Finally, Valeria reached into her purse and pulled out the box of photographs Margarita had given her. "I brought these," I thought. "Maybe you could help me understand them." Eduardo's hands trembled as he took the box. Inside were memories he'd thought were lost forever. Clara's 4th birthday party. Christmas morning 2007. A dozen candid shots of father and daughter playing in the garden at the estate. In the bottom of the box was a small notebook, filled with the same obsessive drawings of sunflowers and monarchs that had started this entire journey. "You kept drawing them," he said, flipping through pages of artwork that spanned decades. "Even after you forgot everything else, you kept drawing our garden." "Our garden." Eduardo looked up from the notebook, seeing confusion and hope warring in her eyes. "Behind the house where you grew up, your mother planted sunflowers there because they were her favorite, and every summer, Monarch butterflies would come to feed on them. You used to sit out there for hours, drawing the same pictures over and over. I remember sitting in a garden, Valyria said slowly, pressing her fingers to her temples as if trying to force the memories to surface. But it's like trying to remember a dream. I know it happened, but I can't quite see it clearly. The woman who took you, she gave you drugs to make you forget. It's not your fault that the memories are gone. Valyria sank onto the bench beside him, the weight of revelation pressing down on her shoulders. Margarita told me everything before she's dying, Cancer. She said a nurse named Carmen brought me to her. Said I was an orphan who needed a safe place to heal. Eduardo's jaw tightened. Carmen was an alias. Her real name is Camila, and she's my wife. The words hit Valyria like a physical blow. Your wife, the woman who kidnapped me, is married to you. For 20 years she was at the hospital when you were born. When your mother died, she knew everything about our family, about our routines, about how to get close to you. Eduardo's voice was hollow with the weight of betrayal. I married the woman who destroyed our family, and I never knew it. They sat in silence for several minutes, both trying to process the impossible complexity of their situation. Around them, the park continued its normal rhythm. Children playing, mothers pushing strollers, teenagers hanging out by the basketball court. Normal life, continuing unchanged while their world reorganized itself around 22 years of lies. What happens now? Valyria asked finally. Now we get to know each other again? Eduardo said, his voice stronger than he felt. You don't have to be Clara Henderson if you don't want to be. You don't have to give up the life you've built as Valeria Greer, but I'd like the chance to be part of your life if you'll let me. Valyria studied his face, seeing decades of grief and hope etched in the lines around his eyes. I don't remember being your daughter. But Margarita always said that family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to love someone every day. Maybe we can figure out how to choose each other. Eduardo felt tears he'd been holding back for hours finally overflow. I'd like that very much. There's something else, Valyria said, pulling out her phone. Margarita doesn't have long, maybe a few days at most, if you want to meet the woman who raised your daughter. If you want to thank her or ask her questions, it has to be soon. The drive back to Valyria's house was surreal. Father and daughter sitting side by side in a car worth more than most people's houses. Heading toward a neighborhood Eduardo had never visited to meet the woman who'd spent 22 years raising his child. The house was small but meticulously maintained, with the sunflower garden that had called to Valyria her entire life. Margarita was awake when they entered, and Eduardo could see immediately that she was dying. But her eyes were alert, and when she looked at him, there was recognition mixed with something that might have been relief. You came, she said simply. Thank you, Eduardo replied, kneeling beside her bed. Thank you for loving her when I couldn't. Thank you for keeping her safe. She was easy to love, Margarita whispered. Both of them were. The scared little girl who came to me and the strong woman she became. You raised her well in those first 5 years. It shows. Eduardo spent the next hour listening to stories about Valeria's childhood, her first day of school, her graduation, the job at Golden Eagle that had led them back to each other. He learned about scraped knees and homework struggles, about Margarita working double shifts to pay for art supplies, because drawing made Valyria happy. When it was time to leave, Margarita called Valyria to her bedside and pressed something into her hand, a key attached to a simple chain. Your father's house, she said. Carmen gave it to me years ago, said if anything ever happened to her, you should know where you really belonged. I think it's time you went home. That evening, as the sun set over Chicago, Eduardo and Valyria stood together in the garden of the Henderson estate. The sunflowers were in full bloom, just as they had been 22 years ago, and monarch butterflies danced among the golden petals like living memories. It feels familiar, Valyria said, touching one of the massive flower heads. Not like remembering exactly, but like coming back to a place I've been dreaming about my whole life. Eduardo watched his daughter, because that's what she was, regardless of the name she chose to use, and felt something he hadn't experienced in over 2 decades. Hope for the future instead of longing for the past. They still had Camila to deal with, and the legal complications of Valeria's stolen identity, and the painful process of rebuilding a relationship that had been interrupted by 2 decades of lies. But for this moment, in this garden where his little girl had once laughed and played, Eduardo allowed himself to believe that some things could be healed. Clara was home. The DNA results arrived on a Tuesday morning that changed everything. Eduardo sat in his study, holding the laboratory report that confirmed what his heart had known from the moment he saw Valeria's drawings. 99.97% probability of paternal relationship. Clara Henderson and Valeria Greer were the same person, separated by 22 years of elaborate deception. Armando was already on the phone with the FBI when Eduardo's cell rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but something in his gut told him to answer. "Mr. Henderson." The voice was young, male, nervous. "My name is Sebastian Gibson. I think we need to talk." Eduardo motioned for Armando to stop his call. "I'm listening. I'm Camila's son, her biological son, and I know what she did to your daughter." The meeting took place at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park. Neutral territory where a 19-year-old Swiss boarding school student wouldn't feel trapped, and a billionaire could blend into the background. Sebastian arrived first, his expensive clothes and careful posture marking him as someone accustomed to privilege, but uncomfortable with attention. Eduardo recognized something of himself in the young man's face. The sharp cheekbones, the way he held his shoulders when nervous. But there was something else. A moral clarity that reminded Eduardo of Anna, which was impossible since Sebastian wasn't Anna's child. "You look like her," Sebastian said when Eduardo sat down across from him. "My mother, around the eyes. And you look like someone who's carrying a burden too heavy for your age." Sebastian laughed bitterly. 19 years of lies will do that to you. She told me everything 3 days ago, about the kidnapping, about the drugs, about how she's been living in your house for 20 years while your real daughter grew up in poverty. Eduardo studied the young man's face. Looking for signs of deception or manipulation, what he saw instead was genuine anguish, the kind of moral crisis that came from discovering that everything you'd believed about your life was built on someone else's suffering. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I can't live with it." Sebastian's voice broke slightly. "Because every advantage I've had, every opportunity, every dollar spent on my education was paid for with your pain. Because Clara Henderson deserves to know the truth, and you deserve justice. What do you know about your mother's plans?" Sebastian pulled out his phone and showed Eduardo a series of text messages. They were from Camila, increasingly desperate, talking about leaving the country, about starting over somewhere beyond the reach of American law enforcement. "She's booked flights to Switzerland for tonight, private jet from a small airfield outside the city. She thinks I'm going to meet her there and we'll disappear together." He looked up at Eduardo with eyes that carried too much knowledge for someone so young. "She has no idea I'm here talking to you." Eduardo felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. After 22 years, Camila was finally going to face consequences for what she'd done. But looking at Sebastian's obvious distress, he found himself feeling something unexpected. Sympathy for the young man who'd been caught in the crossfire of his mother's crimes. "What do you want from me?" Eduardo asked. "Help me do the right thing. Help me make sure she doesn't get away with this." Sebastian paused, choosing his words carefully. "And maybe help me figure out how to live with being the son of a woman who could do something so evil." 2 hours later, Eduardo, Armando, and a team of FBI agents were coordinating a plan that would end Camila's 22-year deception. Sebastian had agreed to wear a wire, to meet his mother at the airfield and get her to confess on tape. It was dangerous. Desperate people did unpredictable things, but it was their best chance to get a confession that would stand up in court. Valyria was at the hospital when Eduardo called to tell her what was happening. Margarita had taken a turn for the worse during the night, and the doctors were saying it was a matter of hours rather than days. The timing was cruel, as Clara Henderson was finally being restored to her rightful place. Valeria Greer was losing the only family she'd ever known. "Do what you have to do," she told Eduardo over the phone, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Just be careful. If she could steal a child and drug her into forgetting her own father, there's no telling what else she's capable of." The airfield was small and private, the kind of place where wealthy people conducted business away from public scrutiny. Camila was already there when Sebastian arrived, pacing beside a sleek private jet with the nervous energy of someone who knew time was running out. "Sebastian, thank God." She pulled him into a fierce hug, and for a moment, Eduardo could almost see the woman who'd convinced herself she was doing the right thing all those years ago. "I was afraid you'd changed your mind. I'm here, Mom. The wire was hidden beneath his shirt, and Sebastian had to fight to keep his voice normal. "But I need to understand something before we leave. I need you to tell me exactly what happened that night with Clara Henderson." Camila's expression shifted, wariness replacing relief. "Why are we talking about this now? We need to get on the plane. Because I can't live with this unless I understand it completely. Please, Mom, help me understand how someone like you could do something like that." From their position in an FBI surveillance van, Eduardo watched Camila struggle with her son's request. She wanted to maintain the fiction that she was the victim, that her crimes had been justified by love and desperation, but she also needed Sebastian's cooperation, and she could see that he wouldn't give it without complete honesty. "It wasn't supposed to be permanent," she said finally, her voice carrying across the wire with perfect clarity. "I just wanted Eduardo to see that he needed me, that Clara would be safer with someone who could focus entirely on her well-being, instead of drowning in grief. So you drugged a 5-year-old girl to make her forget her own father. I gave her medicine to help her adjust to trauma. Children are resilient. I thought she'd be happier with a fresh start, without the weight of all that sadness." Sebastian pressed on, guided by FBI coaching and his own need for truth. "But you never intended to give her back, did you? You married Eduardo while his daughter was living in poverty, calling another woman grandmother." Camila's composure finally cracked. She was better off with Margarita. Eduardo was falling apart, drinking too much, unable to function. That little girl needed stability, and I made sure she got it. Everything I did was for her own good, and everything you did after that. Marrying Eduardo under false pretenses, letting him suffer for 22 years, using his money to pay for my education. Was that for Clara's good too? That was for our good. Camila's voice rose to a near shout. For your future, for our family, for the life we deserved. I earned my place in that house by giving Eduardo 20 years of loyalty and support, built on the foundation of stealing his child. Camila stared at her son, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Whose side are you on, Sebastian? The side of the truth, the side of justice, the side of a woman named Valyria, who grew up believing she was an orphan while her real father searched for her every day for over 2 decades. The FBI moved in before Camila could respond. Eduardo watched from the van as his wife of 20 years was read her rights, handcuffed, and led away from the private jet that would have taken her beyond the reach of American justice. She looked older somehow, diminished by the loss of the careful composure she'd maintained for so long. Sebastian stood alone on the tarmac as the arrest unfolded, and Eduardo made a decision that surprised even himself. He got out of the van and walked over to the young man who just helped bring his mother to justice. "Thank you," Eduardo said simply. Sebastian looked up, his eyes red with tears he'd been holding back. "I'm sorry, for all of it, for what she did, for what I benefited from, for the time you lost with Clara. You're not responsible for your mother's choices, but what you did today, that was your choice, and it was the right one." They stood together in the fading afternoon light, watching as the FBI processed the crime scene that would finally bring closure to a case that had haunted Eduardo for over 2 decades. Somewhere across the city, Valyria was saying goodbye to the woman who'd raised her, and Camila was beginning the journey toward a prison cell, where she'd have plenty of time to think about the lives she'd destroyed in pursuit of a love that was never really hers to claim. The mask had finally fallen, and the truth was free to breathe again. Valeria Greer died peacefully at 3 a.m. on a Thursday, with Valeria holding her hand and Eduardo sitting quietly in the corner of the small living room that had become a makeshift hospice. Her last words were a whispered, "Te amo, Misha," words that carried 22 years of genuine love despite the deception that had brought them together. The funeral was small but meaningful. Held in the little Catholic church in Pilsen where Margarita had prayed every Sunday for 2 decades. Eduardo paid for everything, quietly and without fanfare, understanding that this was his way of honoring the woman who'd raised his daughter when he couldn't. Sebastian stood with them during the service, and for the first time since learning the truth, Valeria felt like she might have something resembling a family again. Camila had been denied bail, a flight risk with extensive financial resources, and a demonstrated willingness to disappear rather than face consequences. She sat in Cook County Jail, awaiting trial on charges of kidnapping, child endangerment, fraud, and a dozen other crimes that would likely keep her locked away for the rest of her life. Eduardo should have felt satisfaction, but mostly he felt empty, hollowed out by years of living with an enemy who'd shared his bed and pretended to love him. "We should change the locks," Armando said as they stood in Eduardo's study 3 days after the arrest. "And probably the security codes. Hell, maybe the whole security system." Eduardo nodded absently, his attention focused on the legal documents spread across his desk. Valeria's identity restoration was complex. 22 years of records that needed to be corrected, financial accounts that needed to be established, educational credentials that needed to be verified. She'd lived her entire adult life as Valeria Greer, and becoming Clara Henderson again wasn't just an emotional journey, it was a bureaucratic nightmare. Sir James, the estate's head of security, appeared in the doorway. "There's been a development." Eduardo looked up, instantly alert. "What kind of development?" "Camila Henderson posted bail an hour ago. Her attorney found a technicality in the way the charges were filed. She's been released pending a hearing next week." The blood drained from Eduardo's face. "That's impossible. They told us she was denied bail. Apparently her lawyer filed an emergency appeal citing procedural errors. The judge had no choice but to release her with an ankle monitor and travel restrictions." Eduardo was already reaching for his phone to call Valeria when Armando grabbed his wrist. "Think about this, Eddie. She's being monitored. She can't leave the county, and she knows we're watching her every move. What's she gonna do? She's already lost everything." But Eduardo had lived with Camila for 20 years, had seen the calculating intelligence behind her carefully composed facade. A woman who could orchestrate the kidnapping of a 5-year-old child and maintain the deception for over 2 decades wasn't going to go quietly into a prison cell. "She's going to run," he said with cold certainty. "Or she's going to try to eliminate the evidence." Valeria was at the Henderson estate when Eduardo's call came through. She'd been staying in one of the guest rooms since Margarita's death, slowly trying to adjust to a house that felt both foreign and familiar. The library had become her favorite space, a massive room lined with books from floor to ceiling, dominated by a stone fireplace where Clara had once listened to bedtime stories. "Camila's out," Eduardo said without preamble when she answered. "Don't go anywhere alone, don't answer the door, and don't trust anyone you don't recognize." "Eduardo, you're scaring me." "Good. You should be scared. A woman who's facing life in prison has nothing left to lose." Valeria was still processing this information when she heard a sound from the front of the house, the distinctive beep of the security system being disarmed. She moved to the library window and peered out at the circular driveway, where a catering van was parked near the front entrance. "There's someone here," she told Eduardo, keeping her voice low. "Catering truck, but we didn't order any food. Get out of the house now. Use the back exit and run to the garage. James should be..." The line went dead. Valeria looked at her phone and saw that the call had been terminated, not dropped. Someone had cut the house's phone lines, which meant they'd also probably disabled the cell tower signal boosters that Eduardo had installed throughout the property. She moved carefully toward the library door, listening for sounds that would tell her where the intruder was. The house was enormous, 47 rooms spread across 3 floors, but she'd learned its rhythms over the past few days. The soft footsteps she could hear were coming from the main staircase, moving toward the 2nd floor where the library was located. Valeria considered her options. The library had no secondary exit, and the windows were too high above the ground to provide an escape route, but it also had something else. A hidden passage that connected to Eduardo's study, a remnant from the house's original construction in the 1920s, when wealthy families often built secret routes for Prohibition-era activities. Clara had discovered the passage as a child, using it to sneak into her father's study during late-night business calls. The memory came back to Valeria with startling clarity, the first real recollection she'd recovered since learning her true identity. She could almost see her 5-year-old self pushing against the bookshelf that concealed the entrance. Could almost hear her own muffled giggles as she surprised her father during important phone conversations. But as she moved toward the bookshelf, the library door opened behind her. "Don't move." Valeria turned slowly to see Camila standing in the doorway, no longer the composed woman she'd been pretending to be for 2 decades. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes wrinkled from jail, and her eyes carried a wildness that spoke of someone who'd finally stopped pretending to be sane. More disturbing was the gun in her hand, a small pistol that she held with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. "Hello, Clara. Or do you prefer Valeria? I can never remember which identity you're wearing today. What do you want, Camila? What I've always wanted. What I've worked for, fought for, sacrificed for over the past 23 years. Camila stepped into the library, closing the door behind her. I want Eduardo to choose me. Really choose me. Instead of spending every waking moment obsessing over his precious dead wife and missing daughter. He already made his choice. He chose the truth. Camila laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. The truth. The truth is that I saved you from a father who was falling apart, who couldn't function without his perfect Anna. The truth is that I gave Eduardo 20 years of loyalty, while you grew up safe and loved with Margarita. The truth is that everyone was better off with my arrangement. Valeria studied Camila's face, looking for any sign of the woman who'd convinced herself she was acting out of love rather than obsession. What she saw instead was someone who'd finally stopped lying to herself about what she really was. You destroyed my family. You stole my childhood. You made my father suffer for over 20 years. I gave your father purpose. Before I came along, he was drinking himself to death and neglecting his business. I stabilized him, supported him, helped him build an empire. Everything he achieved in the past 2 decades was because I was there to make it possible. Built on a foundation of lies. Built on a foundation of necessity. Camila's voice rose to near shouting. You think love is pretty and romantic, but real love requires sacrifice. Real love means making hard choices that other people are too weak to make. Valyria took a small step toward the bookshelf, hoping Camila wouldn't notice the movement. Like kidnapping a 5-year-old girl. Like saving a traumatized child from a situation that was destroying her. Like giving her a chance to heal in a stable environment. Like protecting her from the chaos of her father's breakdown. And the drugs you gave me to erase my memories. Was that love too? For the first time, Camila's expression flickered with something that might have been shame. Children are resilient. I thought, I hoped you'd be happier starting fresh, without carrying the weight of all that tragedy. You hoped I'd be easier to control without my real memories. Camila raised the gun, pointing it directly at Valeria's chest. Enough. You've caused enough damage to my family. Eduardo was finally healing before you came back into his life with your sob story and your convenient memory loss. This isn't your family. It never was. 20 years of marriage says otherwise. 20 years of being there when he needed support, comfort, stability. 20 years of building a life together while you were playing house with your fake grandmother. Valeria could hear sirens in the distance. Eduardo must have called the police when their call was cut off. But the sirens were still far away, and Camila was between her and the only exit from the library. What's your plan here, Camila? Kill me and hope Eduardo forgives you. Disappear and live the rest of your life as a fugitive. Either way, you lose. Maybe, but at least he won't get his precious Clara back. At least he'll finally understand what it feels like to lose everything. The library door burst open before Camila could pull the trigger. Sebastian stood in the doorway, his face pale with determination and terror. Mom, don't do this. Camila spun toward her son, the gun wavering between 2 targets. Sebastian, what are you doing here? What I should have done years ago, stopping you from destroying any more lives. The distraction was all Valeria needed. She dove toward the bookshelf, pushing against the hidden mechanism as Camila's attention focused on her son. The passage opened just as the gun fired, the bullet splintering wood inches from Valeria's head. You chose them over me! Camila screamed at Sebastian. Your own mother! And you chose strangers over me! Sebastian stepped into the library, placing himself between his mother and the passage where Valeria had disappeared. I chose right over wrong. I chose justice over family loyalty. I chose the kind of person I want to be instead of the kind of person you raised me to be. The second gunshot came as Eduardo and the police reached the library door. The gunshot had been an accident, Camila's hand jerking when Sebastian stepped toward her, the bullet going wide and embedding itself in the oak-paneled wall of the library. She dropped the weapon immediately, collapsing to her knees as the weight of 23 years of lies finally crushed what remained of her sanity. Eduardo found Valeria in the hidden passage, unharmed, but shaking from the adrenaline of nearly dying at the hands of the woman who'd stolen her childhood. They held each other in the narrow space between the walls, while police officers secured the scene and paramedics checked everyone for injuries. It's over, Eduardo whispered into his daughter's hair. "She can't hurt us anymore." But even as he said the words, Eduardo knew that healing from decades of trauma would take much longer than a single moment of resolution. Camila was led away in handcuffs for the second time in a week, and this time, there would be no technicalities, no legal loopholes, no chance of freedom. Sebastian had testified against his own mother, and that testimony would ensure she spent the rest of her life behind bars. 6 months later, the morning sun painted the Henderson estate's gardens in shades of gold and amber, as Clara, she'd legally reclaimed her birth name while keeping Valyria as her middle name in honor of Margarita, stood among the sunflowers that had called to her for 22 years. The flowers were massive this year, some reaching nearly 10 feet in height, their faces turned toward the light like natural compasses pointing toward hope. "The architect thinks we can have the foundation building ready by spring," Sebastian said, approaching with a steaming cup of coffee, and the easy familiarity that had developed between them over the past months. He'd chosen to stay in Chicago after his mother's trial, working alongside Clara and Eduardo to build something positive from the wreckage of their shared trauma. The Clara Henderson Institute for Missing Children was Eduardo's idea, but it had become their collective passion, a place where families separated by tragedy could find support, resources, and hope. The building would rise on a piece of land adjacent to the Henderson estate, designed to look more like a comfortable retreat than an institutional facility. "Mrs. Patterson called this morning," Clara said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "The Golden Eagle family wants to make a donation to the institute. Even Jake's putting together a fundraiser with some of the other employees." It still amazed her how people from her old life as Valeria Greer had embraced her new reality as Clara Henderson. The transition hadn't been easy, legally, financially, or emotionally, but the community in Pilsen had rallied around her with the kind of support that reminded her daily why Margarita had felt so at home there. Eduardo emerged from the house carrying a large framed photograph, the kind of formal portrait that wealthy families commissioned for their walls. But this one was different. Instead of posed perfection, it captured a moment of genuine joy. Clara and Eduardo working together in the garden, both of them laughing at something Sebastian had said from behind the camera. Dirt under their fingernails, sunflower petals in Clara's hair, Eduardo's expensive shirt wrinkled from honest work. "Where should we hang it?" he asked, holding the frame up for their inspection. "Somewhere Margarita would have approved," Clara said immediately. "Maybe the front hallway of the institute. So every family who comes to us for help will see that healing is possible." Eduardo nodded, understanding the significance. The photograph represented everything Margarita had taught Clara about family, that love was a choice made daily, that bonds forged in crisis could be stronger than those created by blood alone, and that healing required both honoring the past and embracing the future. Sebastian's phone buzzed with a message from his academic advisor at Northwestern University, where he'd enrolled as a psychology major with a focus on family trauma counseling. He'd chosen to use his trust fund, money that had originally come from the Henderson companies, to pay for his education and fund his work at the institute. It was his way of transforming the ill-gotten gains of his mother's crimes into something that could help other families avoid similar devastation. "Professor Martinez wants to know if we'd be willing to speak to her graduate students about family reunification challenges," he said, reading the message. "Apparently our case study has become part of the curriculum," Clara laughed, though there was still sometimes a note of disbelief in her voice when she talked about their case study. The media attention had been intense but brief. A few weeks of sensational headlines about the Chicago heiress who grew up in poverty, before the news cycle moved on to other tragedies and triumphs. What mattered more were the families who'd contacted them directly, people dealing with their own missing children, or recovered memories or complicated questions about identity and belonging. The institute wasn't even officially open yet, but they were already providing informal support to dozens of families across the Midwest. "Tell her yes," Eduardo said. "The more people understand how complex these situations can be, the better equipped they'll be to help when they encounter them professionally." As afternoon settled over the estate, the three of them worked together in what would become the memorial garden at the institute. Clara had insisted on dedicating space to the people they'd lost along the way. Anna Henderson, who'd died bringing Clara into the world, Margarita Greer, who'd loved a stolen child as her own, and even Ramon Greer, whose involvement in the kidnapping had been motivated more by loyalty to his grieving sister than by genuine malice. "Do you think she knew?" Sebastian asked as they planted a new row of sunflowers. My mother, do you think she understood what she was really doing? Or did she convince herself it was all justified? It was a question they'd all wrestled with during the long months of legal proceedings and therapy sessions. Camila had been diagnosed with several personality disorders during her psychiatric evaluation, but the experts couldn't agree on whether her crimes had been the result of mental illness or simple selfishness. I think she knew, Clara said finally. At least on some level. People don't put that much effort into covering something up unless they know it's wrong. Eduardo wiped dirt from his hands and stood up. Surveying their work, the memorial garden was taking shape beautifully. A space that acknowledged loss while celebrating the possibility of renewal. Monarch butterflies had already discovered the new plantings, and their orange and black wings created a living kaleidoscope among the golden flowers. Your mother used to say that monarchs were proof that transformation was always possible, he told Clara. Even after caterpillars seem to completely disappear, they emerge as something more beautiful than they were before. Clara touched the engagement ring on her left hand, a simple band with a small diamond that she'd chosen with David, the social worker she'd met during her volunteer work at a homeless shelter. Their relationship was still new, built on shared values and genuine affection, rather than the desperate neediness that had characterized Camila's pursuit of Eduardo. I like that, she said. The idea that we can honor where we came from while still becoming who we're meant to be, as the sun began to set. They gathered on the back porch of the Henderson estate, watching monarch butterflies dance among the sunflowers while the Chicago skyline glittered in the distance. It had taken 6 months of therapy, legal proceedings, and careful relationship building to reach this point of calm acceptance. Eduardo had been right that first day in the park. Healing was a choice they made together every day. Clara didn't remember being his 5-year-old daughter, but she was learning to be his adult daughter, building new memories while honoring the ones that had been stolen. Sebastian was finding his own path between the guilt of his mother's crimes and the hope of his chosen family. Some days were harder than others, but the work they were doing together gave all of them a sense of purpose that transcended their individual pain. The Institute's board meeting is next week, Eduardo said, checking his phone calendar. We'll need to finalize the budget for the first year of operations. And the scholarship program, Clara added. I want to make sure kids from neighborhoods like Pilsen have access to the resources they need, regardless of their family's financial situation. Already handled, Sebastian said with a grin. I may have inherited my mother's determination, but I'm using it for better purposes. As darkness fell over Chicago, 3 people who'd been brought together by tragedy continued planning for a future built on hope instead of lies. The sunflowers around them were beginning to bow their heads as evening approached, but they would turn toward the sun again when morning came. Clara Henderson, who had been Valeria Greer, who carried both names and both histories as part of her complete identity, finally understood what Margarita had been trying to tell her all those years. Family wasn't about perfect beginnings or uncomplicated love stories. Family was about choosing each other, day after day, even when the path forward was uncertain. It was about forgiveness without forgetting, about healing without erasing the scars that proved how far they'd traveled. It was about sunflowers that grew toward the light, and butterflies that danced between earth and sky, carrying hope on wings too beautiful to be anything but miraculous.